There are stories that don't fit inside greeting cards, last-minute flowers, or recycled phrases pulled from social media. Stories that can't be erased with a simple sorry or an improvised dinner. Mine began with a red dress chosen with the same care as someone stitching memories into fabric, and ended, or rather, truly began with a one-way ticket to Madrid. It may sound dramatic, but sometimes, you have to flip the entire table just to reclaim your own place at it. Mother's Day had always been, for me, one of those sacred moments marked by laughter, long conversations, and the warm embrace of Edward, my only son. But that year, the embrace never came. In its place, I found a silence that screamed, an empty chair, and a social media post that felt like someone had ripped a piece straight out of my chest. There he was, smiling beside Marjorie, his stepmother, calling her his real mother. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of realizing that someone you love has simply decided to erase you from their own story? It's a strange mix: shock, hurt, and an almost blinding clarity. And inside that clarity, a shift was born. Not the kind of cinematic revenge you see in movies, but a quiet, almost surgical movement toward liberation. I no longer wanted to try to fit into the life of someone who had already uninvited me from it. This isn't just a story about abandonment. It's about boundaries. It's about the courage it takes to recognize when it's time to stop begging to be seen and start seeing yourself for real. It's about the consequences of saying enough, and about the kind of independence that has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with dignity. In the next few minutes, you'll walk with me through every step of that path, from the red dress and the table set for a lunch that never happened to the colorful streets of Madrid, where I rediscovered pleasures I thought I had lost forever. You'll see how abandonment can transform into an unexpected form of self-love, and maybe, just maybe, find clues for doing the same in your own life. Because if there's one thing I've learned on this journey, it's that life doesn't return the time we've lost, but it will always offer us new places to start over. The real question is, would you have the courage to go? Florence had always believed that certain dates demanded more than just showing up. They called for ritual, care, and a special touch. And for that Mother's Day, she decided to gift herself a red dress, one of those understatedly elegant ones that turn heads without trying too hard. When she tried it on, she realized she wasn't just wearing fabric, she was wearing a piece of hope. Hope for the lunch she'd share with Edward. She could still recall, in vivid detail, the years he'd surprise her with flowers, handwritten cards, and a genuine smile that lit up his whole face. It felt as though every thread of that dress whispered the same reminder: despite the hardships, there was a bond between them that could never be broken. Or so she believed. Hanging the dress on the wardrobe door, she felt that delicious nervous flutter of someone counting the days to a special reunion. As she walked through the city streets to have the hem slightly adjusted, Florence found herself remembering the conversations she used to have with Edward when he was still a teenager. They always met in the same place, their usual a little restaurant with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. In those moments, time seemed to pause. It was their refuge from the world. That was where she imagined they'd spend yet another Mother's Day, talking about everything and nothing all at once. This thought made her spend hours imagining the details. Maybe she'd order the lasagna Edward loved so much, and they'd raise a toast. It was simple, but rich with meaning. Florence was never vain in the superficial sense, but she knew certain occasions deserved a little extra care. And the red dress, with its clean cut and soft fabric, would be the symbol of the celebration. She wanted Edward to see not just Mom, but the woman behind the title: strong, resilient, still capable of reinventing herself. Choosing red, the color of passion, but also of courage, felt almost poetic. Looking in the mirror, she thought she looked more beautiful than she had expected. It's going to be a good day, she told herself. That confidence, though, carried a quiet secret. She knew their relationship had grown distant lately. And this lunch, well, it might be a chance to bridge the gap. The preparation for that lunch became a kind of personal event. On the morning of Mother's Day, Florence woke up early, put on some classical music, and made herself her favorite coffee. As she applied a soft pink lipstick and adjusted her hair, she imagined the moment Edward would walk into the restaurant, the warm smile he'd give her, the way his eyes would light up. She even rehearsed in her mind The mix of affectionate words and light teasing she would say, little hints about how he'd been absent lately. It was her way of saying I miss you without sounding dramatic. The red dress, hanging just a few feet away, seemed to watch her like a silent accomplice, ready to help her mark the day in her memory. The anticipation wasn't only about the meal itself, it was about what it represented. Florence knew relationships don't strengthen on their own, they need to be watered, cared for, trimmed of the excess. That lunch, to her, was a chance to water what they had before the distance between them became an unbridgeable gap. Flashes of other years played in her mind, Edward arriving with a mismatched bouquet from the corner store, or asking to change tables so they could have more privacy for their conversation. Small things, but to her, they were worth gold. And that day, she was determined to create another one of those memories. Curiously, in choosing the red dress, Florence was also choosing to ignore certain worries that had been hovering in her mind. The last few cold phone calls, the visits cancelled at the last minute, she decided she wouldn't let those shadows ruin the moment. After all, what is a relationship if not the collection of moments we choose to preserve? She preferred to focus on the smile she pictured, on the sound of his laughter, on the feeling of being important again in her own son's life. That thought was enough to keep her moving forward, even though some part of her already knew the day might not go as planned. As she got ready, she even thought about what Edward might wear. It didn't really matter, but she always noticed how good he looked in a light blue shirt. Maybe, if he showed up in that shirt, it would be a sign the day was truly in her favor. Florence had a habit of attaching meaning to little details, treating them like good omens. It was her way of making the world feel warmer, more predictable. In her mind, every element had its role: the familiar restaurant, his favorite dish, the table by the window, and of course, the red dress that now seemed to hold all of a mother's hopes. She went over the day's plan in her head. Arrive early. Ask for their usual table. Greet Agnes, the kind, long-time employee who knew them well. Wait for Edward, without checking the clock too often. She even considered ordering a glass of wine to pass the time. Maybe she'd bring him a small gift, something symbolic, like a book he had loved as a child. It was her way of saying, no matter how much time passes, there will always be space for you in my life. And with that red dress marking the start of this chapter, she believed the day could only end well. Deep down, Florence knew she was placing too much weight on a single meeting. But who hasn't done that? Who hasn't pinned years of hopes onto one moment, believing it might mend what has slowly been breaking? She didn't blame herself for wanting it to be special. The red dress, the restaurant, the memories, they all came together to form a scene that felt almost cinematic. And like any movie, she was hoping for a beautiful ending. She had no idea that sometimes, life prefers to write stories with plot twists we never saw coming. Florence arrived at the restaurant before their agreed time, as she always did. She liked having time to choose the table, greet Agnes, and settle in before the rush began. Their usual smelled just as it always did, the unmistakable aroma of fresh-baked bread and herbs, the kind of scent that wraps around you like a hug. Agnes smiled warmly when she saw her. New dress, Florence? You look stunning. The compliment wrapped around her like a good omen. She ordered a glass of white wine, adjusted the napkin on her lap, and glanced at the doorway every few minutes, expecting to see Edward crossing the street. The place was getting busier now, filled with families carrying bouquets and gift bags. Florence watched them with a bittersweet smile, remembering how Edward used to rush toward her when he was younger, his hands clumsily holding flowers wrapped in paper, his grin worth more than anything money could buy. The clock on the far wall ticked 15 minutes past the hour, but she didn't mind. Maybe he'd stopped to pick up something special. Maybe traffic was holding him up. Hope was still stronger than anxiety, and the red dress felt like armor against any creeping pessimism. 30 minutes passed. Agnes, in that quiet, professional kindness that comes from years of reading situations, asked if Florence wanted to order her meal while she waited. She declined, saying she'd rather wait. She noticed a few people stealing glances in her direction, maybe sensing she was alone on Mother's Day. She kept her posture straight, smiling faintly at the empty space across from her, as if she had all the time in the world. But inside, expectation was starting to knot itself with a subtle sting of discomfort. An hour. That's when she felt the weight of time truly settle on her shoulders. The wine was gone, and she ordered water more to keep her hands occupied than to quench any thirst. She picked up her phone and sent a short message. "Everything okay? I'm at the restaurant." No reply. The room was now full. The background music seemed louder, or maybe it was just that the silence between her and her son was becoming deafening. And then, almost without thinking, she opened Instagram. A habit one that, in that moment, became an open wound. There, at the top of her feed, was a photo of Edward, smiling beside Marjorie. The caption read, "Lunch with the real mother. Happy Mother's Day." Florence read and reread the words, as if looking for a typo that could change their meaning. But there was no mistake. The abandonment was there in pixels dressed up with likes and approving comments. She didn't know if what she felt was anger, grief, or just a hollow emptiness. The wine glass, the red dress, the restaurant in an instant, they all lost their meaning. For a fleeting moment, she thought about getting up and walking out without paying just to escape the invisible stares she now felt burning into her skin. But she stayed. It was as if her body hadn't yet received permission to move. The abandonment wasn't just physical, it was public. And somehow, that hurt even more. Agnes must have noticed the change in her expression because she quietly approached and placed the bill on the table, without asking questions, without offering sympathy. And strangely, that absence of words was a relief. Florence signed the receipt, stood, and walked to the door with measured steps, refusing to give the world the spectacle of her pain. The red dress, which in the morning had felt like a promise, now seemed to weigh 100 pounds. Stepping out into the street, the cool air brushed against her face, bringing with it an uncomfortable clarity. Edward hadn't simply forgotten, he had chosen to be somewhere else, with someone else, and given her the title that had always been Florence's. And in that moment, she understood something had broken in a way that could never be put back together. What she didn't know yet was that this break would also mark the beginning of a liberation that would change everything. Florence walked home slowly, as if every block was a minefield of painful thoughts. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it for a moment, and took a deep breath, trying to keep the tears from spilling. It wasn't just about Edward's absence at lunch, it was the weight of all the years she had put his needs before her own. Silent sacrifices, jobs she had turned down so she could be present for him, sleepless nights spent nursing him through illness, financial decisions always made with his comfort in mind. And thinking about all of that now, she felt as though a whole chapter of her life had been discarded without a second thought. She sank into the armchair in the living room, still wearing the red dress, and let her mind flip through memories like an old photo album. There were happy snapshots, but also moments where she could now see the early signs of distance, cold conversations over the phone, rare visits, excuses always wrapped in "I've been so busy." The scene at the restaurant wasn't an isolated event, it was simply the most obvious. Realizing that brought a strange kind of relief, at least now there was no denying it. And somewhere in the middle of that storm of emotions, she noticed something unexpected. The pain, though sharp, carried with it a seed of freedom. It was as if, by being pushed aside, she had been given permission to finally put herself at the center of her own life. It wouldn't be easy, but the thought was beginning to take shape. She remembered a phrase she had once heard sometimes: abandonment is just the door someone opens so you can step outside and breathe fresh air. For the first time, those words made sense. Night fell, and with it came the decision. Florence stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out a medium-sized suitcase, its surface dusty from years of disuse. She began placing clothes inside, as if her body already knew where to go before her mind had fully decided. Among the folded garments, she placed the red dress carefully, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of the exact moment she realized she needed a change of scenery. Sitting at the kitchen table, she opened her laptop and began searching for destinations. London appeared as an option, but it didn't excite her. Paris felt too romantic for the state her heart was in. Then, almost by accident, A travel article about Madrid popped up on her screen. Narrow streets, colorful facades, lively markets, cafes spilling with conversation. She felt an immediate pull. Madrid seemed to hold just the right energy for getting lost and finding herself again at the same time. Without overthinking, she opened the website of an airline and saw a promotion for the following week. One way, the banner read, as if it were a cosmic joke or maybe an invitation. She typed in her card details and, when the confirmation email appeared, felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. For the first time in years, she was doing something entirely for herself, no permission asked, no explanations given. As she closed the laptop, she wondered how Edward would react when he realized she had vanished from his daily life. Maybe he'd call. Maybe he'd be irritated. Maybe he wouldn't even notice right away. But for once, none of that mattered. Her focus was on herself now, on rediscovering who she was outside the role of the always available, ever-sacrificing mother. This new kind of freedom had nothing to do with bitterness and everything to do with emotional survival. That night, she fell asleep earlier than she expected, wrapped in a strange mix of grief and excitement. The hurt was still there, but now there was something else woven into it, the possibility of a new beginning. And deep down, Florence knew she had just taken the first step onto a path there would be no turning back from. The plane touched down in Madrid on a clear morning, the sun casting a golden glow on colorful facades and balconies overflowing with flowers. Florence stepped off with a single suitcase in hand and a blend of nerves and thrill in her chest. The language was a challenge, but the smiles and vibrant energy of the city made her feel immediately welcomed. She had chosen to rent a small apartment in Malassa, a neighborhood known for its bohemian charm and slow, lived-in rhythm, where artisan bakeries shared the streets with old bookstores. The place she found was modest, but had a wrought-iron balcony that opened onto a lively street, perfect for watching life go by. From the moment she stepped inside, she knew she'd made the right choice. The first week was devoted to settling in. Florence wandered the streets without hurry, mapping cafes, markets, and plazas. In a small stationery shop, she bought a beautiful notebook and began jotting down little discoveries: the creamy coffee served in a glass cup, the soft music of a violinist playing at a street corner, the warm scent of churros drifting through the air at dusk. Each note felt like planting a seed in the soil of her new life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt she had space to breathe without explaining where she was or what she was doing. It was on one of those unhurried walks that she met Beatrice, the owner of a small cafe adorned with black and white photographs and the warm, comforting smell of fresh pastries. Beatrice was in her early 60s, with expressive eyes and a natural kindness that made conversation flow easily. Noticing Florence's accent, she struck up a conversation, and before long, they were making plans to meet again. The cafe quickly became their almost daily meeting place, where they spoke about books, recipes, and, from time to time, the challenges of starting over in a new city. Without Florence realizing it, Beatrice was becoming an anchor in this fresh chapter of her life, a steady point she could return to while navigating the unfamiliar. Another unexpected friendship bloomed with Clara, a spirited 25-year-old Spaniard who dreamed of working abroad and was looking for English lessons. Florence, with her patient nature and sharp sense of humor, agreed to help. Their lessons took place either in Florence's apartment or at charming cafe tables scattered across the neighborhood. Between grammar exercises and bursts of laughter, Clara would share stories of life in Madrid, introducing Florence to places far from the tourist trail. This generational exchange brought a lightness to her days, making Florence feel part of something alive again. Life began to take on a new rhythm, a rhythm she had chosen for herself. Mornings often started with coffee on her balcony, watching the street below come to life. After that, she would walk to the market to pick out fresh fruit and cheese, exchanging hesitant Spanish phrases that, while imperfect, still managed to earn her warm smiles. Afternoons were divided between writing in her notebook and exploring neighboring districts. And in the evenings, she liked to sit on a bench in Plaza del Dos de Mayo, observing groups of friends and couples, almost as if she could soak up the city's social energy through the air. Learning Spanish became a chapter of its own. There were funny mistakes and small victories, moments when the right word came to her without hesitation, and others when she completely misunderstood what someone had said. Beatrice taught her idiomatic expressions that made locals chuckle, while Clara encouraged her to take risks and speak more freely. Little by little, the words stopped feeling foreign and began to fit together like the pieces of a puzzle she was determined to finish. Meanwhile, across the ocean, messages and calls from Edward began appearing on her phone. Some were short, others more insistent. Florence didn't answer a single one. Her decision was firm not out of spite, but because she knew how fragile her newfound peace was. She refused to let it be disturbed. Every call left unanswered felt like a quiet affirmation: I am keeping the promise I made to myself. And so, between coffee cups, long walks and new friendships, Madrid began to feel less like an escape and more like home. The red dress remained tucked away in her wardrobe, no longer a painful reminder, but a milestone, a marker of the exact moment when she had chosen herself. She was starting to see that moving to another city was only the surface of the change. The deeper transformation was happening inside her. And she sensed there was still so much more to discover. Florence soon realized that true reconstruction doesn't begin with grand gestures or sweeping decisions. It begins with small, deliberate acts repeated every day. One morning, instead of heading to her usual cafe, she decided to prepare breakfast at home: fresh fruit, warm bread from the market, and coffee that filled the apartment with its rich aroma. She noticed that, in Madrid, there was no urgency to rush through the day, and that slower rhythm gave her space to savor the simplest pleasures. The distant toll of church bells mingled with the smell of coffee, creating a scene that felt almost cinematic. It was in these details that she found proof she was on the right path. Writing became an essential part of her new routine. In the notebook she had bought shortly after arriving, Florence began recording not only the events of her days but also deeper reflections on her life. Memories from the past wove themselves together with present discoveries, forming a narrative that without her even realizing was turning into something like a book. When Beatrice read a few pages, she encouraged Florence to see it as more than a personal journal. Your story could help other women understand that starting over is possible, she said, serving her a cup of tea. The idea began to take root in Florence's mind, slowly becoming more than just a passing thought. Despite repeated attempts from Edward and other relatives to contact her, Florence stood firm in her silence. She knew that if she gave in even once, she might find herself back in the same patterns that had caused her so much pain. Every ignored call became a reminder she had the right to her silence. The boundary was not just about distance, it was emotional, too. It was her way of saying, my well-being matters, too. Clara, always curious and full of energy, began inviting Florence to cultural events and small gatherings with friends. At first, Florence hesitated, afraid she might not fit in. But soon, she realized these interactions were quietly strengthening her confidence. At one such gathering, she was introduced to a local book club. The first meeting happened to be about The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, and Florence was captivated by the depth of the discussion. She left that night with a list of books to read and a new group of people she could now call friends. The book club quickly became another anchor in Florence's new life. Every 2 weeks, she found herself walking through Madrid's winding streets to the small library where the meetings were held. They sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, sipping tea or wine, and diving into lively discussions about the characters, the writing style, and the life lessons tucked between the lines of the books. For Florence, it was more than literature, it was connection. Listening to different perspectives reminded her that life could be interpreted in endless ways, and that sometimes, the meaning we find in a story has more to do with where we are in life than with the story itself. Slowly, the heaviness that had followed her from home began to dissolve. The loneliness she had feared so much turned into solitude, a solitude she now welcomed, one that felt rich rather than empty. Still, there were moments when the past crept in unexpectedly. An older man in a cafe reading the newspaper in a way Edward used to do, or the faint smell of his favorite cologne drifting from a passerby, little triggers that momentarily pulled her back to a place she no longer lived in. But now, instead of letting the memories weigh her down, she let them pass, like clouds moving across a wide Spanish sky. One evening, after a particularly warm day, Florence decided to wear the red dress again. Not for a dinner, not for an occasion, and certainly not for anyone else's approval, just for herself. She paired it with flat sandals, left her hair loose, and walked to a small tapas bar she had discovered with Clara. Sitting at a table outside, she ordered a glass of Rioja and a plate of patatas bravas. The air was soft, carrying the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint strum of a guitar from somewhere nearby. She felt an ease in her chest, a kind of peace that came from knowing she had survived what she once thought might break her. She looked down at the red fabric and realized it no longer held the weight of disappointment or rejection. Instead, it had become a quiet emblem of resilience, proof that sometimes, what begins as a moment of pain can evolve into a declaration of self-worth. By the time she finished her wine, the city's lights were flickering on, casting a golden hue over the streets. She took the long way home, weaving through alleys and plazas, feeling, for the first time in years, completely at home in her own company. Florence's days in Madrid continued to unfold like this, a blend of the ordinary and the unexpected, each one shaping her into someone she had almost forgotten she could be. And though she didn't know exactly how long she would stay, she no longer felt the urgency to decide. The city had given her something far more valuable than an address or a routine. It had given her back to herself. The first meeting happened to be about The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, and Florence was captivated by the intensity of the conversation. She left that night with a list of books to read and with a new group of people she could now call friends. As the months went by, her appearance began to mirror the internal transformation. Her shoulders, once hunched under the weight of worry, now stood tall. Her wardrobe had taken on brighter colors, not just the red dress, but floral blouses, flowing skirts, and colorful scarves. It was as if the palette of her life had been repainted. Even her walk had changed: steady steps, a curious gaze, and a faint smile that appeared without effort. The apartment in Malassa, once just a temporary stopover, slowly became a true home. Florence decorated the walls with photographs of Madrid streets, filled the balcony with plants, and carved out a special corner for reading and writing. That space became a refuge, a place where she could reconnect with herself. And curiously, the stronger she grew, the less she felt the urge to revisit the past with Edward in her mind. The understanding that distance can also be a form of love came to her on a rainy day. Sitting by the window, watching the parade of colorful umbrellas pass by, Florence realized that by stepping back, she was protecting not only herself but also her relationship with her son from further wear and tear. Sometimes, loving someone means accepting that you cannot save them from their own choices. And for the first time, that truth didn't sadden her, it brought peace. Florence's rebuilding did not happen through a single heroic act, but through the accumulation of ordinary days lived with presence and intention. Every cup of coffee, every page she wrote, every stroll through the streets of Madrid was a brick in this new emotional structure. She didn't know it yet, but this fortress she was building would soon be tested by events that would challenge every boundary she had learned to set. Florence was sitting at her favorite table in Beatrice's cafe, going over notes for a possible chapter in her book, when the door opened and, to her surprise, Marjorie walked in. The initial shock made the air feel heavier. Her stepmother, impeccably dressed in a navy blue coat, scanned the room until her eyes met Florence's. There was a brief silence, as if both women were sizing each other up without a word. Marjorie approached with measured steps, and Beatrice, sensing the tension, discreetly stepped away to give them space. Without preamble, Marjorie revealed the reason for her visit. Edward was facing serious financial and personal difficulties. "He needs you, Florence," she said, trying to keep her voice calm but unable to hide a trace of urgency. Florence, who until then had remained impassive, gave a faint smile and replied, "Funny, he didn't seem to need me last Mother's Day." The words dropped like a stone in the middle of the conversation, making it clear she had neither forgotten nor forgiven the wound left months before. Marjorie tried to soften things, saying the past had been a misunderstanding, something Edward now deeply regretted. But Florence was unwilling to accept vague apologies. Years of exhausting patterns had taught her that remorse without real change was nothing but theater. "If he wants my help, he'll have to prove he deserves my presence," she said, looking straight into her stepmother's eyes. Marjorie went on to list Edward's struggles: mounting debts, lost clients, constant arguments with Harold. Florence listened in silence, showing no rush to reply. In truth, she felt strangely calm. Since her arrival in Madrid, she had learned that her peace was non-negotiable. And in that moment, she would not allow herself to be pulled back into a cycle of emotional dependency disguised as necessity. When she finally spoke, Florence was direct. Love doesn't mean erasing all the consequences of someone's choices. It means being present, yes, but not as an eternal savior. I did that once, and I lost myself in the process. I won't do it again. Marjorie seemed unsure how to respond. Perhaps she had imagined that simply asking would make Florence rush back. But this renewed version of the woman she once knew was no longer willing to give up her hard-won independence. There was a moment when Florence even felt compassion. After all, Marjorie seemed to be carrying her own burden, perhaps fearing her marriage to Harold was hanging by a thread. But compassion did not mean submission. Marjorie, tell Edward the first hope he finds his way. But that path will have to be walked by him, not me, she concluded, rising to end the conversation. Marjorie, seeing there was no room to insist, gave a restrained nod and left the cafe. Florence watched through the window as her stepmother disappeared into the bustling streets of Madrid, a graceful figure, but with slumped shoulders. Deep down, there was relief in knowing that this time, she had drawn her boundaries clearly and that they would be respected, even if by force. Back at her notebook, Florence wrote a sentence that would become a mantra: true love demands responsibility and consequence. It was a reminder not only for Edward, but for herself. A silent promise that from now on, her life would be built on conscious choices, not on impulsive rescues. More than a year had passed since that Mother's Day. Florence was once again at Beatrice's cafe, reviewing her notes and sipping her cortado, when the door opened, not to reveal Marjorie this time, but Edward himself. He looked thinner, his eyes weary, his posture slouched. For a brief moment, Florence wondered if she was dreaming. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, yet it seemed to stretch into minutes. Edward walked toward her slowly, as though unsure of the reception he would receive. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice almost swallowed by the gentle hum of conversations in the cafe. Florence gestured for him to sit, but her expression remained neutral. He began with justifications: work commitments, emotional confusion, Marjorie's influence. I didn't realize how much that would hurt you," he said, avoiding her gaze. Florence waited patiently for him to finish, her hands resting lightly on the cup in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Edward, it wasn't an innocent mistake. It was a choice. And worse, it was public. You didn't just leave me waiting, you gave my place to someone else and made sure the whole world could see it." Edward tried to interject, but she raised her hand, asking for silence. "The truth is, I don't need justifications anymore. What I need is respect. And respect isn't something you request, it's something you build." Edward sighed, shifting his approach. He said he missed her, that he didn't want things to end like this. "Can we go back to the way things were?" he asked, his voice carrying a poorly concealed hope. Florence shook her head slowly. "The way things were? When I ignored the warning signs and settled for scraps of attention? No, Edward. I have no desire to return to that. I've learned how to live without depending on your recognition." Her son seemed unsettled. He tried appealing to old memories, bringing up family trips and happy moments they once shared. But Florence refused to be drawn into nostalgia. "I don't erase the good things, but they don't cancel out what came afterward. I won't build a future on an incomplete past. If you want to be part of my life now, you'll have to understand the limits I've set." The conversation continued in a lower tone, but the essence remained unchanged. Edward wanted her to step back into the role of unconditional supporter, the safe harbor he could run to whenever things went wrong. Florence, however, knew that doing so would mean giving up everything she had fought for in Madrid. "I don't wish you harm, Edward. But I also won't sacrifice my peace to save you from yourself." When the conversation came to an end, Edward stayed silent for a few seconds, as if absorbing the weight of her words. Finally he stood, placed a few coins on the table, and said, "I didn't expect to hear this from you." Florence smiled faintly. "And I didn't expect to need to say it. Yet here we are." He turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind him feeling like a period, perhaps a calm in their relationship. Florence remained seated for a few more minutes, breathing deeply. She knew that the conversation hadn't resolved everything, but it had made it clear that the old dynamic no longer had a place. Later, as she wrote about the encounter, she noted love without boundaries becomes a prison. Love with boundaries is a choice. And for her, that choice had already been made. A few weeks after meeting with Edward, Florence began receiving strange correspondence at her apartment in Malassa. They were letters from British lawyers, written in formal, clipped language, requesting her signature on documents regarding the sale of the old family home. At first, she thought it was merely an administrative procedure, but upon reading more carefully, she realized there were clauses that could leave her with no financial share whatsoever. Edward's name was there, alongside Harold's, as interested parties. Florence was not entirely surprised. She was already familiar with her son's talent for turning personal problems into urgent matters that somehow became someone else's responsibility. This time, however, the pressure came cloaked in legal formality, which demanded extra caution. She sought out a local lawyer recommended by Beatrice, who quickly spotted the trap. If she signed, Florence would be relinquishing rights that could be crucial in the future. "They're counting on you being in a hurry to get this over with," the lawyer warned. A few days later, Edward called. His tone was impatient, almost aggressive. "Mom, just sign it and be done with it. It's nothing. The house is a burden for everyone." Florence listened in silence before replying. "For me, the real burden is accepting unfair terms. And I don't do that anymore." The call ended abruptly, and she felt the distance between them, which was already considerable, on the verge of becoming a chasm. The attempts didn't stop there. Marjorie sent messages appealing to her emotions. "Think about what you're doing, Florence. He needs to start over. This house is in the way." Florence recognized the manipulative tone instantly. For years, she had given in to that kind of pressure, believing she was helping. Now, she understood that giving in was simply perpetuating a cycle of irresponsibility. The matter escalated to the point where Spanish lawyers began contacting her, proof that Edward and Harold were willing to cross borders to achieve their goal. But Florence had already made her decision. She would not sign anything unless every condition was clear and fair. More than that, there was a principle at stake. This was no longer about property, it was about respecting the boundaries she had set. Her lawyer advised her to respond formally, refusing to sign under the current terms and making it clear that she was willing to negotiate, but only transparently. This reply, simple as it was, struck a blow to Edward, who had expected immediate compliance. Days later, she received a short message from him. "You've changed." She smiled when she read it and thought, yes. "And I'm not going back." The pressure gradually began to fade, as if Edward had realized that he could not move forward without reaching a legitimate agreement. For Florence, that victory had little to do with the financial aspect and everything to do with the emotional one. It was proof that she could uphold her boundaries even in the face of calculated attempts to dismantle them. More than that, she felt she had solidified a new kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice in order to be heard. In the end, she sat down with Beatrice at the cafe and recounted the entire episode. "You know this isn't really about the house, don't you?" her friend said. Florence nodded. It was about never again letting anyone, not even her own son, decide what she should be willing to give up. That clarity would prove essential for what was about to happen, and for the inevitable conclusion to Edward's story. The news arrived on a cold autumn afternoon, while Florence was leafing through a worn-covered book at the reading club. Clara came rushing into the cafe, looking as though she wasn't sure whether she should speak, and handed Florence her phone with a message already open. It was from an acquaintance in London. "Have you seen? Edward lost the house. Declared bankruptcy." Florence read it without the slightest change in her expression. What once might have shattered her heart now simply echoed as the inevitable outcome of choices he had made for himself. Soon after, more details began to emerge. Harold and Marjorie had divorced, and rumors suggested that part of their separation involved financial disputes sparked by Edward's failed business ventures. Florence wasn't surprised. She had always known that, without clear boundaries, her son would lean on anyone willing to rescue him until there was no one left. Beatrice, sensing the unspoken tension, asked if she was all right. "I am," Florence replied calmly. There was no trace of morbid satisfaction, no revenge, only a quiet sense of relief. For the first time, she was watching a storm from a safe distance, seeing it rage outside without feeling the need to run into it. It was like watching thunder through the window of a warm, secure home. Edward did attempt to reach out again, this time with a tone that was far more subdued. He sent a short message, "We need to talk." Florence thought for a few minutes before replying, "I hope you're doing well. But my life is here now." There was no bitterness in the words, only the certainty that she would never step back into the role of savior. The days that followed were marked by a silence that, unlike before, no longer felt heavy. Florence realized she had crossed the most difficult threshold, no longer feeling responsible for the course of Edward's life. That sense of emotional independence was something she once thought impossible. During a reading club meeting, she reflected on how Edward's downfall had, paradoxically, strengthened her own growth. "Sometimes people need to lose their footing to learn how to walk on their own," she remarked to her friends. She received understanding looks and recognized that the sentence also applied to herself. Her own ground had disappeared the day she was abandoned at the restaurant, and yet she had learned how to move forward. Walking through Plaza del Dos de Mayo that evening, Florence felt a quiet wave of gratitude. Not for Edward's bankruptcy, but for the path she had walked to arrive at that moment. Madrid, with its golden lights and lively voices echoing through the streets, had become the stage for her liberation. Deep down, she knew Edward's story still had chapters yet to be written, but she was certain of one thing: whatever the plot, she would never again be a secondary character in his life. His fate was now entirely in his own hands, and hers, finally, in her own. Florence's mornings in Madrid now followed a ritual entirely her own: waking early, throwing open the windows to let the sunlight flood in, and brewing a strong cup of coffee while watching the street come to life. The sound of animated conversations mingled with the clinking of cups from nearby cafes, a daily reminder that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The city was no longer just the backdrop to her new beginning, it had become an extension of her very identity. She no longer came from London as a woman fleeing a wound, she came to live fully, consciously, and independently. Over time, she began to notice that her story was inspiring other women. At the reading club, during conversations at Beatrice's cafe, or in classes with Clara, someone would inevitably ask how she had found the courage to break patterns that had once seemed unbreakable. Florence answered with honesty, "It wasn't courage. It was necessity. The alternative was to lose myself completely." Those conversations began to feel like part of her purpose, almost a quiet mission she had taken on. She also solidified a personal philosophy about love. For Florence, loving someone didn't mean absorbing all the consequences of their choice, it meant offering support without surrendering herself. "Help is not permission for abuse," she once wrote in her notebook, circling the sentence. That clarity brought with it a lightness she hadn't felt in decades. The red dress, once a symbol of profound disappointment, became something she wore with pride. One evening, she wore it to a dinner with friends, and Beatrice commented, "That dress tells a different story now, doesn't it?" Florence smiled. Yes, now it speaks of freedom. The dress no longer carried the shadow of abandonment, but the gleam of a turning point. Edward still appeared occasionally on social media, but Florence had stopped following his life. His world was no longer a place she needed to inhabit. She was at peace with the idea that each person walks their own path, even if that means watching from afar, sometimes with no contact at all. That acceptance, to her, was the ultimate proof that she had moved on. With Clara, she began a volunteer project teaching English to older women in the neighborhood. Many of them carried their own stories of starting over, and Florence saw parts of herself reflected in each one. The makeshift classroom was filled with laughter and stumbling attempts at pronunciation, yet there was something powerful in the air, a room full of women rediscovering that it is never too late to learn, or to reinvent themselves. At night, writing in her notebook, Florence reflected on what it meant to be her own real mother, the caretaker of her own soul. It was an idea that went beyond superficial self-care. It meant taking full responsibility for her happiness, her choices, and her peace of mind. No one else would hold the keys to her emotional life again. In this way, she had not only established a new routine, but forged a new identity. Florence was no longer defined by abandonment, but by the way she had answered it. In Madrid, she had found not just a city to live in, but a mirror that reflected the woman who had always been there, waiting to be seen by herself. Florence's story is, at its core, the story of many people who have spent years believing that love is synonymous with unconditional sacrifice. How many of us were taught from an early age that to love is to always give in, to always put the other person first, even if that means putting ourselves last? Her life shows us, with striking clarity, that this kind of love, without boundaries, is dangerous not because it is false, but because it leaves us empty. And emptiness cannot hold anyone up. Florence didn't simply wake up one morning strong and determined. What transformed her was the accumulation of small pains, swallowed silences, and frustrated waits. The turning point didn't arrive in the form of a grand, heroic gesture, but as a simple, quiet choice. She said enough. Enough of waiting for recognition where there was no interest. Enough of erasing herself in order to maintain a relationship that only existed when it was convenient for the other person. Enough of believing that the only way to love was by abandoning herself. That enough was not a shout, it was a whisper that grew over time. It grew when she ignored a phone call she knew would pull her back into the same cycle. It grew when she refused to sign documents that would strip her of what was rightfully hers. It grew when she looked her own son in the eyes and told him she would not return to the life she had before. And this kind of growth is not hers alone, it is available to anyone who, regardless of age, is willing to choose themselves. Many, when hearing this story, might think, but what about family? Isn't it your obligation to be there, no matter what? That is a question that weighs heavily, especially on those over 50 or 60 who were raised in a generation that equated love with total devotion. But the answer Florence found was liberating. Being present does not mean erasing yourself. Love is not living to rescue the other person, it is walking alongside them. And walking together is only possible when both are moving forward of their own free will, not out of obligation or guilt. This reflection becomes even more necessary when we reach a stage in life where time becomes more precious than any bank account. After decades of caring for others, we often forget that we, too, deserve care, attention, joy, and purpose. Florence's journey reminds us that reinvention is possible, yes, after 60, after 70, after any age, in fact. And that this reinvention is not selfishness, it is an act of respect for oneself. How many stories like hers do you know? Perhaps you are living your own version right now, waiting for someone to call, to visit, to truly see you. Perhaps you are afraid to take a step toward your own freedom because you fear the judgment of others. But think about it, at the end of your life, what will weigh more, the judgment of others, or the regret of not having lived as you wished? Florence's Madrid does not have to be yours. Yours might be learning something new, moving to a different city, finally starting the business you always dreamed of, traveling alone for the first time, or simply creating a daily routine that fills you with peace. What matters is not the geography, it is the decision to put yourself back at the center of your own life. When you choose yourself, the rest of your choices begin to align naturally. And if there is one lesson to take from this story, it is this: it is never too late to rewrite who you are. It doesn't matter if you have been through divorces, losses, changes, or even bankruptcies. What matters is that today, you can take one step, no matter how small, toward a life that is more yours, more authentic, more whole. So, if this story has touched something in you, I want to extend a special invitation. Stay here with me. On this channel, we talk about real new beginnings, about practical courage, About stories that prove life doesn't end at any age. Life only ends when you decide to stop choosing yourself. Click the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories, and if you can, leave a comment sharing what your Madrid would be. Who knows, your story might be the next to inspire someone else. You've already lived long enough to know there is no time to waste. Let's move forward together.